very happy to delve into the topic and to invite Anna to the floor. Let me prepare the presentation quickly. So while Anna is preparing, let me shortly introduce her. So Anna Aakerblom works as a program officer at Swedwatch, which I'm sure she will introduce shortly, the organization that she works for. But they did very interesting research on the pharmaceutical supply chain in India, and that will be the bulk of her story today. But aside from that, she has experience in public procurement. She also engaged with the new European legislation that is emerging on that topic. So we're very much looking forward to hear her story. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Anna Aakerblom. I work at the Swedish NGO called Swedwatch. We were funded in 2003, and since then we have published over 100 research reports on multiple topics, including public procurement. So really glad to hear about this program where we sort of have pushed the Swedish public procurement agency to really work on this. So we see some progressive work on that in Sweden. But I'm here today to talk about a research project that we initiated 10 years ago. It was back in 2019 when I started looking into the pharmaceutical industry. And because we heard from a partner that there were these conditions in the pharmaceutical supply chain. And I realized I didn't know much at all about where our medicine is produced or how it is produced. And I talked to my colleagues, and then no one knew. And I mean, I'm very humble that it's a different thing with the medicine that we actually really need. My dad was really sick in cancer at the time. It was, absolutely vital that he got the medicine that he needed. It's not the same thing as with a sweater that you don't really need. So it's a different sector. But where I at least thought that everything was sort of more under control, you sort of see white coats, you think it's very strict and precise, and that this is, I don't know, potentially made in Europe, done under strict controls. However, that is not what we found. Perhaps not surprisingly, we learned that a large share of the medicine that we consume is produced in countries such as India and China, known for lax implementation of legislation, known for high prevalence of corruption. And through a contact, we got in contact with a woman called Cecilia Di Pedro, which is now heading one of the sustainability department at one of Sweden's largest private pharmacies. But back in the mid 2000s, she was a master's student at the University of Gothenburg, and she sort of followed our medicine to Hyderabad in India. As you can see on the map, this is a couple of years old, but for the antibiotic supply chain, and you can see two hubs there. Sort of, it's yellow in India, it's Hyderabad, and then there's another spot there in China. And she, together with a local organization and a few other Swedish scientists, they took water samples. And at one effluent plant, they took samples and they found that in one day, the amount of the broad spectrum antibiotic ciprofloxacin that were released was enough to treat 44,000 people in one day. That was the residues from this effluent plant. And that is not only worrying for the people living in the vicinity of those factories. It's not only we're worrying for the animals or the land. It's also a potential global threat because it can be a breeding ground for antimicrobial resistance, which in a minute sort of can spread globally. So it's both a local but also a global problem. Yeah, this was a few of the news article that came out of that, and also a couple of reports. In 2019, this was at the same time that we did our research. We didn't know until in 2020 when they released this. The Swedish pharmacy that I mentioned, one of the leading pharmacies, Apotek Hjärtat, they did a commercial where they had tested the water again. And I will try to show this movie. You never know if it works. To show you what they found. It worked. So, okay, that worked. I just need to get to the next slide. Yeah. So, okay, yeah. So we knew that there were large problems with industrial emissions, especially in countries such as India and China, home to a lot of generic medicines and productions of generic medicines. But a few years, we hadn't seen this movie yet, so a few years had passed since the last research had been done. And we asked ourselves, is it still the same? Has there been any improvement? Is someone following up on this and the horrible results that we have seen earlier? But also, what does this really mean for the people living in the vicinity of the factories? So Swedwatch, together with a local partner organization called Gamana and Anil Dayakar, who is sort of who has worked on this topic for decades. We traveled to a couple of different villages in the area of Hyderabad to conduct interviews with people. We didn't take any new samples. That's not really, unfortunately, part of our portfolio. We need universities to come in and do that sort of work. But we could definitely see that the problems were still there. One factory manager that we interviewed told us that they have license to produce a certain amount of pharmaceutical, but if they want to, and they have license to release a certain amount of effluents, but if they want to produce more medicine, they need to apply for another license, and that might take a really long time. So in order to sort of increase profits, they tend to produce more. But that effluence from that medicine cannot be used. They cannot use their sort of effluence plants for that, so they dump it elsewhere. And you can see how the rivers look here. And I mean, so Hyderabad is home to I think around 800 industries, and so there are other industries there, not only pharmaceutical factories, but it's definitely like one of the biggest pharmaceutical manufacturing hubs. I think it produces 40% of the medicine in India. And according to this campaign launched by Apotek Hjärtat, 70% of the medicine that we consume in Sweden was also produced in Hyderabad. So I don't know the numbers for Belgium, but Hyderabad is supplying the world. The factories also release gases, and a factory manager told us that reactors are cleaned adequately during the day, but not during night. So therefore, the stench is exceptionally bad during night. I mean, one of the major issues here is the access to clean water. So local residents, they have lost access to clear water sources that used to be used for household, for drinking, for agriculture, for the animals. And they described to us how the water makes people sick and animals sick. Which has also been supported by a few other publications, and that they cannot use it as they used to. Now they are dependent on water coming from elsewhere. What is sort of one of the most interesting parts, of course, is how people living in the area are affected by the effluents. How their health is affected, and that's really hard to say something about. There is a lack of studies on that, how the sort of cocktail effect of different pharmaceutical effluents and other effluents, how they impact their health. There is a Greenpeace study, I think that's the only one that we found, at least from 2004, that found high morbidity rates related to cancer, asthma, and heart disease, in which also was outside of Hyderabad. But I think there has been no such study since then, and none who has confirmed that study. But people that Swedwatch met there, they talked about skin rashes, skin different things, problems with their skin, also respiratory problems. Also loss of income due to illness and increased healthcare costs. So what we learned was that it was sort of described as a race to the bottom business practice to produce affordable medicine. One huge problem in India is, of course, also corruption, and I'll get back to you. So despite having legislation in place, it's not followed because there are so much corruption in every sort of step of the supply chain. There is also threats towards people trying to stand up for the rights of the people. So back in Sweden, we tried to sort of realize, why is development so slow? Why is nothing improving? I think at the time, our local partner had worked on this issue for 15 years, but no changes. And sort of, we interviewed a number of different stakeholders, including investor, a pharmacy, public procurer, and a leading scientist from Sweden as well on the subject. And they all pointed to two different reasons. One was the lack of transparency in the pharmaceutical supply chain. And the other one was that the environmental risk assessments that companies need to do to put medicine on the European market, that they are not really taken into account when in the decision if it's approved or not. And also that the environmental risk assessments, at least at that time, did not focus on, didn't have in scope, wasn't the production phase. It was the using phase and sort of the end use phase, but not the production phase. So this problem was really sort of out of scope. The ones who did not agree with that, perhaps, were the companies that we interviewed. And I had looked at the export data from Hyderabad to Sweden and found those four companies, I mean, among others. So this is just that they had connections to the market. They did not have any public disclosure information. And I think we'll talk more about that later. I mean, the very different views between the industry here and between the scientists and other actors, where the pharmacy that we talked to said that we cannot perform our human rights and environmental due diligence that we need to do in our supply chains because we don't know where the things that we purchase actually come from. And the public procurers said the same. We cannot take this into account when we choose what to buy and not to buy, because we don't know. And the scientist said that I can follow this because I don't. It's such a hard thing not to crack where things actually are made. So, but on the company side, there was another opinion, which was that we need to keep this confidential because otherwise we lose business, or there might be a risk that someone will steal the medicine, or terrorism could even be a thing that could be used. So they had no strong opinion on, or they did have a strong opinion, but they didn't want to share their supply chains, basically, or information on their supply chains. Even though one company said that I can't see any reason really why we should be treated differently, compared to the textile supply chain or something else. A year later or so, we did a review of authorization agency's website. So when you apply for to get a medicine out on the European market, and I guess in other countries as well, you actually need to submit the information on how it's made or on the supply chain information. But this is then not shared with other actors. And that's the case in Sweden, at least. It's due to business secrecy. It's not shared. We only found then, I'm a bit unsure if we covered all the countries in the world. There was my colleague who did this, but at least what she found was one exception to the rule, and that was New Zealand. And it would be really interesting to follow up on how New Zealand, what makes them different here compared to the other nations. But there you could actually see, as the general public, you get to know the manufacturer of the medicine. And this is much more, as we understand it, in line with the Aarhus Convention and so on, that you need, as public, you have a right to know this, to get to know this type of environmental information. Yeah, so what we have is sort of a complex web of global actors. We have limited visibility of supply chain. And this might perhaps be a bit provocative, but what we see in Hyderabad, at least, the effects of voluntary industry initiatives such as PSCI and the AMR Industry Alliance, they have not really made any difference on the ground. And due to sort of the findings we have here, I mean, because because pharmaceuticals are so vital, the medicines are so vital, but at the same time, they are causing these effects on the ground, and they are also potentially the production is sort of also a major threat to the global population when it comes to AMR. So that's why we named the report The Health Paradox. And to the right, it's the other policy paper that we have put out on increased transparency in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Before I was going to come here and talk about this, so we did the research in 2019, so it was a couple of years ago, and I was keen to understand if there had been any changes to this date. So we called our local partner. Sorry for the picture, Anil, but this was the best thing I could get out of the call, to get an update from his side. And I was sort of hoping that we would that would have been some progress to report. On the other hand, I was not perhaps very surprised to hear that it hadn't. He said that the problems are still the same. If anything, it has gotten worse. He had been out in these villages 2 weeks ago with another master's student. And he said that he sort of felt an increased urgency among the people, that women were sort of running towards him, asking him to do something, that the smell was now so bad that they couldn't sleep at night. And at the same time, these people can't really sell their land because no one really wants to live there. So they're sort of stuck in the situation where they have lost a lot of livelihood and income, but they're also sort of stuck in this situation and without any remedy. He also said that they tried to interview a doctor and to see sort of, can we learn anything new about the health situation for the people? And but he said that doctor just replied that, no, I'm being paid by the pharmaceutical companies not to talk about this. If you pay me more, I could potentially share something. But that was sort of very illustrated situation where the corruption is so in every aspect of the in all actors. So yeah, a bit disappointed to hear that, even though perhaps not surprised. What Anil asked for was sort of that he wanted some sort of European EU monitored effluent plant that could sort of secure that was actually active and it was functioning, and that would sort of lower the risk of corruption and misconduct. And he also asked for more studies. He said, please, can someone now follow up on this? What has happened? What is the situation now? How much influence are there? So, I mean, he said that he was out and he was looking at the hidden pipelines from the pharmaceutical factories, and that's still a fact. And he could smell that it's the same smell that he has felt for almost 20 years. He also tasted the water, and he apparently had done that through these 20 years. He tasted the water, and he sort of recognized the taste as well from these different effluents. So a bit of a gloomy picture, perhaps. It's a really hard task to solve India's corruption problem. But there are, of course, other things that we could do. And as I said before, the demand for increased transparency, so we actually know and can follow up on where is our medicine produced and how. More studies, especially perhaps more studies on the impacts of people's health. And I haven't talked that much about it, but we have also, Swedwatch has worked on the new EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, which means that companies need to take into account, or they need to look at the risks and mitigate the risks in their supply chains, hopefully in their full value chains, and that they would also be liable for the harm that they have caused. So this is a situation where a lot of European and global companies have sort of they are part of this supply chain, and they are part of the problem, and therefore they also have a responsibility to solve it and to remediate the people living in the area. And right now, it's also they are looking at a new pharmaceutical hub outside Hyderabad, which would be home to a lot of pharmaceutical factories. So it's also of high importance that gets done in a correct way. So far, not that good. I know that people have been they have sold their land to the government, or if it is, no, I think it's the government who then provides it to the companies, and for very low amounts, for example. But there is a lot more to look into, and this as we learned, at least from the Swedish professor Joachim Larsson, who has done a lot of studies on effluents from pharmaceutical production, that this does not only happen in India and China, it also happens in Europe. But there is no sort of the full picture of how severe the problem is. It's not there yet, because it's just not enough scientific data. The Commission is just now, they put out a revision of the EU pharmaceuticals legislation. So there is an opportunity there to provide input to the Commission on what should be included when the legislation, the directive and the legislation is updated. So from our part, that's going to be on transparency and the inclusion of environmental risk assessments. Yeah, and also just for it's a hard task, but an efficient implementation of this new corporate sustainability directive could be one thing, that companies actually get their processes in place to handle these problems. And last but not least, responsible public procurement. As I said before, the public procurement agencies in Sweden, they have had some problems related to transparency, not the least. Also limited capacity and actually following up on the requirements that they put in place. But that is something that should be amped up for them to be able to do more, I think. And there also collaboration. We have that in Sweden between different Swedish agencies, procuring or procuring authorities. But that is absolutely something that could be done on a European level as well. I think that is it.